What's on your radar, Batya?
Well, Robbie, it seems that reports of the death of bipartisanship are greatly exaggerated. Last week, the House passed a bill protecting same sex marriage by a comfortable margin and 47 Republican votes. That's now headed to the Senate, and we'll know shortly if it has the 60 votes needed to pass. The Senate is also planning another vote this week that is expected to pass with bipartisan support, this one known as the CHIPS Act. The bill is supposed to help us start to manufacture semiconductors here in the US. What are semiconductors? Most of you probably know this already, but for any of my fellow English majors out there, a semiconductor is a piece of equipment made out of silicon or germanium that is highly processed until it's perfectly designed to control and manage the electrical current in electronics. Once processed, they become a crucial component of computer microchips in electronic devices from your smartphone to your TV to your air conditioner to medical equipment to electric cars to all major US defense systems. That's right, all of them, especially artificial intelligence and weaponry. The process of making these microchips is just mind-blowing. Try putting how to make a semiconductor into a YouTube search if you want to truly appreciate the ingenuity of man, or if, like me, you managed to get this far in life without having learned any of this. The transistors that combine to make chips are tiny. We're talking 14 billionths of a meter. A microchip can be the size of a fingernail, but have over 100 layers and billions of transistors in it. It can take 700 processing steps and 14 weeks of processing time to make a microchip. And because they're so small, you need to use deep UV rays to construct the chips because the dimensions of the pieces you're trying to manufacture are less than the wavelength of visible light. The factories also have to be super clean because even a single particle of dust can destroy a whole batch of microchips. And they need to be totally resistant to the vibrations of the outside world. So this is why it costs about $10 to $20 billion to build a semiconductor factory, which are known as fabs. That's a super heavy lift for someone wanting to get into this business, or even for a country wanting to get into this business. So maybe it's not surprising that one country has a near complete monopoly on making semiconductors. 92% of the world's top chips are manufactured by Taiwan, specifically the giant Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC for short. Taiwan's dominance dates back to a decision made in the 1980s to focus on making chips for other companies who wanted to cut costs and focus on design rather than manufacturing. Of course, that was right around the time that both political parties in America decided to start shipping good working class jobs in manufacturing off to China and Taiwan and Mexico. Taiwan took that suggestion and really ran with it when it came to the manufacturing sector that would define the future. It's not just the jobs, though. The global supply chain crisis has also come for semiconductors, revealing how vulnerable we are under the current setup. The supply chain for chips is extremely complex. It involves hundreds of raw materials and over 50 kinds of high-tech equipment, plus thousands of suppliers from Europe, America, and Asia. And then there's the national security question here. The way things are now, our military is completely reliant on a country that our greatest adversary believes it has sovereignty over. Under the One China principle held by the People's Republic of China, there is only one sovereign state of China, and it includes Taiwan. The threat posed by a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan would mean that China would essentially control the fabs that produce crucial parts of our military's equipment. Not a great situation. The threat of being cut off completely from 92% of our semiconductor supply is real, and the impact would be devastating, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo warned last week. Quote, if you allow yourself to think about a scenario where the United States no longer had access to the chips currently being made in Taiwan, it's a scary scenario, Raimondo said. It's a deep and immediate recession. It's an inability to protect ourselves by making military equipment. We need to make this in America. Enter the CHIPS Act, which stands for Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors for America. The bill earmarks $52 billion in incentives to companies to start building chip manufacturing plants here in the US. $39 billion would be for chip makers to build fabs, and another $11 billion is earmarked for semiconductor research and development. It's hardly enough to fully fund a domestic semiconductor industry, but it's a start, something like a down payment for companies willing to jump into the race. The main beneficiary would be Intel, which already had plans to spend $20 billion to build a microchip factory in Ohio, which it promised to turn into $100 billion if the CHIPS Act passes. Intel is expected to get $30 billion from the CHIPS Act, so more than its initial investment. And the company expects this to translate into 3,000 Intel jobs and 7,000 construction jobs, though it postponed the groundbreaking of the fab in a hissy fit when the CHIPS Act was delayed. The Senate is expected to vote on the CHIPS Act this week, on Wednesday probably, and it's already passed a procedural vote last week with a hope-inducing 64-34 margin. But one person who voted against it might surprise you, Senator Bernie Sanders, who called the package corporate welfare and joined many Republicans, as well as the Wall Street Journal's editorial board and the Heritage Foundation, in opposing the bill. Like I said, reports of the death of bipartisanship, greatly exaggerated. Last year, Intel could afford to give its CEO, Pat Gelsinger, a $179 million compensation package, Sanders said on the floor of the Senate. Over the past 20 years, Intel spent over $100 million on lobbying and campaign contributions while shipping thousands of jobs to China and other low-income countries. Does it sound like this company really needs corporate welfare? Senator Sanders asked. It's interesting that Senator Sanders has less of a problem of paying corporate welfare to corporations willing to transition to green energy than he does to corporations offering thousands and thousands of working class Americans good-paying jobs. That's for another radar. The truth is that many countries pay billions to shore up domestic manufacturing. And if it was kosher for the government to make trade deals that incentivized offshoring good manufacturing jobs, surely it's appropriate for the government to incentivize bringing those jobs back. It's not corporations' job to worry about having a stable middle class, much as I wish it was. It's the government's. Others have argued that it's not feasible to build an industry on American wages when you have a country full of Taiwanese workers willing to work for much less. But that again speaks to the corporate welfare argument. If government subsidies are going to sweeten the deal for Intel to pay good wages to American workers instead of worse wages to Taiwanese workers, that's not taxpayer dollars going to corporate welfare. It's taxpayer dollars going to shoring up the working class and the middle class. As long as these fabs are producing something that every single sector of the American economy needs, paying a living American wage for it should be a no-brainer. So it's good that the CHIPS Act has an added provision prohibiting companies from using the funds they get for stock buybacks or to pay dividends. And it's also good that all of this has garnered the CHIPS Act the support of everyone from Mike Pompeo to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. Speaking of Pelosi, there's something of a fake news meme going round about a recent stock purchase her husband made. Paul Pelosi recently bought $5 million in shares of NVIDIA, a semiconductor manufacturer, and many were saying that this rose even to the level of insider trading, given how close the purchase was to the vote on the CHIPS Act. We actually touched on this last week, but it turns out that NVIDIA is a fabless semiconductor manufacturer, meaning that they design semiconductors, but their semiconductors are made by another company, Silicon Foundries, and fabless companies actually won't get any money from the CHIPS Act. I still don't think politicians and their spouses should be allowed to trade stocks, but in this case, it's not quite as Evel Knievel as I had initially thought, so small correction there. Pelosi herself is actually planning a trip to Taiwan, which has the Chinese very upset, and we'll be talking about that in the next segment. But when it comes to the CHIPS Act, we're really looking at what I hope is a new strain of bipartisanship built around good working class jobs that support solid middle class lives. To me, this is great, but Robbie, I know you're not on the same page as me, so I want to hear
Batya.
I want to hear the libertarian argument against this corporate welfare.
No, I agree with Bernie Sanders on this one. It is corporate welfare, and you're right to point out his hypocrisy in that he supports subsidies for green jobs, but I don't support those subsidies either. I don't support any of them. Look, I think it's great if Intel wants to make chips here in the good old US of A. Absolutely. And if the regulatory regime is unfavorable, I absolutely make supporting the regulatory regime more favorable. Now that's going to involve probably a lot of labor restrictions gone away. You might not like that. There might be some environmental or environmental impact regulations that could be gotten away with. You might agree with those. So let's be open for business. Let's make it as easy as possible to build factories factories here, to hire people, to pay them what the company wants to pay them, not what the government wants to pay them. And yeah, let's go to town. But to artificially create one via this network of subsidies, I mean, I love Amazon. I defend Amazon on the show all the time. I didn't want to, all the incentives we gave them to headquarter here in D.C. were disgusting. I wouldn't have done any of that either. So look, for the tree to take root, for it to flourish and grow, it should be justified by the market itself and the business model. If we got to prop it up, it will wither and die. Then we're going to fund something else. We're going to get new ideas. And also there will be constant complaints. You're right to point out how this one isn't exactly the conflict of interest maybe we thought it was initially. But there's going to be so much backroom dealing and, well, this is in this congressperson's interest, or this is in my district's interest and this is not in mine. I think it gets real gross real fast. Now, I don't have a good answer to the issue that, yes, we're very reliant on Taiwan and that it's a national security issue. Look, I don't like that it's a national security issue, but my solution would be to see if we could ease the regulatory regime. I think subsidizing it has a lot of bad. You're smiling at me. I think it's a bad way to go, but it's a legitimate disagreement, and I don't want the climate to force. The regulatory climate to force these companies to move these jobs overseas. It seems like bringing them back would be good. It just seems very, very not feasible to do it. Because what if they take this money and then they don't build the factory? That's happened so many times. That's happened with eminent domain, where they knock down people's houses so they can, you can grow a new factory or something, and then they don't build it anyway.
Well, Congress has been very clear that there's going to be a lot of oversight here, and a lot of, that they reserve the right to demand the money back. If they don't see something that they like, if nothing happens. I do think that the national security concern makes this something that I think that's probably why a lot of conservatives are supporting giving, this much money to a corporation. This, $52 billion is nothing to sneeze at. So we never have a problem with, the government paying for the military, right? And
well, I do,
10
but
to
yeah.
20. Oh, okay. But, $10 to $20 billion to start one of these factories is it's such a heavy lift. But their role in the economy is so crucial. I mean, we will never not have a demand for semiconductors, right? So when I think about, these disasters of central planning, like, in communist countries where, there was, they would force people to grow things because the centralized government wanted that thing to be grown, and then they would end up, throwing it out because there was no demand for it. We'll never be in a situation like that. There will always be a demand for semiconductor chips. The more the better, and the better the better. So to me, that seems like we're not going to end up in a situation where we're sort of paying people to produce something we don't need. We're going to be in a situation where we're paying working class Americans middle class wages to produce something that we all rely on, which is the American dream.
Well, thank you, Batya, and we'll have more Rising right after this.